But
Good afternoon, everybody. I hope that you have had a chance to have something to eat. You are refueled and re-energized because you're going to have to put on your thinking caps now for a session. The idea of this is that we really give you the soft skill stuff, but there's also lots of technical stuff that you need to learn about too. So we are joined this afternoon by Alan van Vuuren, who is the CEO of B2Wise. B2Wise has not been around all that long, but have grown exponentially in the last couple of years. They adopted the demand-driven MRP methodology, and they've been helping clients to get the best results through the use of that. And I don't know how many of you in the audience, I'm too scared to ask, know about what DDMRP is. I'm hoping some of you do. Can we kind of get a thumbs up for those of you that do? Anyway, so Alan's going to take you through a bit of story about demand-driven in a kind of simplest way so that you can get your heads around it and learn more about it because it's really important. It's kind of the way of the new normal. So you do need to know about it and you need to really understand how it adds value and what it does for an organization. So Alan, over to you. Thank you very much for your time. I know you have a very busy schedule. He's off to Europe later today. So we're very grateful that you're able to give us this time this afternoon.
no,
Thank you.
Thank you. Always good. Always love presenting with SAPEX. It's always fun, and we try and keep it fun. But yes, like you say, B2Rs, we've grown a lot. The last few years, very much driven off the growth of DDMRP. And you say technical session, I'm going to try desperately to keep it not technical because we are also a big fan of trying to simplify this whole planning process and try and give a really simple solution to quite a complicated problem. So my background, I come from a supply chain consulting background, and the last 5 years I have dedicated my professional career to supply chain planning. And what I'm going to take you through today is our perspective on how companies go about running their supply chain planning process. And it really boils down to one of two ways, either what we call a artistic approach or a scientific approach. Okay. So what is the objective of all planners in a business? What are supply chain planners doing in organizations? And really what they're doing is they're walking a tightrope. They're trying to maintain, yes.
Sorry, are your slides supposed to be up?
Yes, they should be.
We are not seeing your slides.
Oh no, well that's going to make it a challenge.
I'm sure you could do it without them, but I very much think you would like to have them.
Let's try that again. Let me share my screen. Are you now seeing them?
I see it. Can you just put it in presenter mode?
There we go. Have you got it?
Perfect. There you go. Good to go. Thanks, Alan.
But now you can see the pretty pictures. It would have been so boring without the pictures. Okay. So what planners are trying to do is they're trying to maintain this balance. They're trying to walk this tightrope and manage this process of saying, how do I balance the inventory that I need to have in the organization with the service levels that are demanded by my customers? How do I make sure I've got the stock so that when they place the order, it's available and I can deliver it and they're happy and they feel like, okay, I'm getting a good service level. And they're trying to do this with the backdrop of the capability of the organization. And our capability could be the production capacity. How much can they actually produce? It can be cash. So how much cash flow is actually available in the business to buy the inventory that they need to maintain that service level. And they're constantly walking this tightrope to make sure that they're not overemphasizing any of these three attributes that they're actually trying to manage. And the way they're doing this is using their primary process. And this should be something that's quite familiar to you attending if you've gone through any sort of supply chain, and even in marketing, you cover this, is the replenishment process. Now, what is the replenishment process? Well, it's very simply the question of saying, how much do I need to order from my suppliers? And when do I need to have that available? When do I need that stock in my organization? And once I've made that decision, where do I put it? So where in my distribution network, in the single warehouse that I may have, or all the different warehouses spread across the massive network that I may have, if that's locally in a country or across multiple countries, where do I keep the stock? And this is a constant process that supply chain planners are going through on a weekly basis, a monthly basis, sometimes on a daily basis. How much do I need to order? When do I order it? And where do I put it? Now, the message from the supply chain that we find dealing with different organizations, and we've now done quite literally hundreds of different supply chain planning implementations, typically is the same, depending on who you're talking to in the business. If you're talking to the finance director or anyone in the financial department, a CFO, they are saying we need to reduce costs and we need to reduce inventory. We need to reduce working capital. Why? Well, they're looking at the income statements, they're looking at the balance sheets, and they're trying to manage the financial position of the business. And this is their goal. At the same time, the sales director is saying, well, I'm trying to meet sales, I'm trying to meet forecasts, everyone's complaining about my bad forecasts, but it's impossible to get it accurate because customers and the client just constantly changes their mind. They tell us they're going to order 500 units and then they turn around and order 2,000. How on earth am I going to plan for that? At the same time, our supply chain planners tend to work outside of a system. They tend to spend all their time gathering this data, gathering these forecasts, trying to work out that replenishment process, and they tend to be doing it all in Excel. And it's exceptionally complicated and very, very time consuming. The production team and the manufacturing guys are saying, well, there's too much variability. We need some sort of stable plan, because they're getting measured on how efficiently they're using their production environment. How busy is their production line? And if the priorities keep changing and there's lots of variability, it's very hard for them to do that. And ultimately, what happens? Well, on either side of the company, the suppliers and the customers, they just tend to get upset about the whole story. Okay. So, how do companies go about managing this, and how do companies go about running their replenishment process? Well, we find there's really two approaches. There's the formal route and there's the informal route. And you can think of this as the scientific way or the artistic way. And this is very much a left brain versus right brain type of situation. And if you know how this works, typically your left brain, or if you're a left brain person, they say you tend to be quite logical. You tend to be driven by numbers. You're quite analytical. You like systems. You like processes. There's a lot of structure. Or you go the other route, the informal route, where you tend to follow a lot of creativity, a lot of emotional intelligence, a lot of imagination, a lot of out-of-the-box thinking. Now, in any business you walk into, there tends to be a balance between these two, the logic and the creative side to managing the problem. Depending on the business culture and the mix of people in the supply chain team, it tends to lean one way or the other way. And we tend to see this in any environment that we walk into. Now, let's talk about the first one. If you're artistic and if you're following that artistic approach, what tends to happen is you become very reliant on individual planners, individual people in your supply chain team that are the superheroes of the organization. They are just the best people in the company. Everyone knows who they are. They stand out in the bunch. They just shine. They deliver. They're problem solvers. And they always seem to make the right call. They just know the business exceptionally well. They know how the different departments linked together. They know who the customers are and how they behave. They know which suppliers are difficult and how to manage that. They know the numbers exceptionally well. These are people that have been in the organization for an extended period. And what they're doing is, in the center of this chaos, they're like this traffic officer. They are moonwalking around and just solving problems left, right, and center. They often call them firefighters. They just, there's a problem, one of those customers kicks up a fuss, and they just know how to get it solved. And the biggest reason they're doing this is these people tend to genuinely care. They really care about the business. They want to help. They have that human nature trend that says, I want to fix this problem. And they're very, very good at doing it. And these are the people that make this artistic approach work in an environment. The issue with this is that every hero has his day. And when we say every hero has his day, well, if you're reliant on a person, at some point that person's either going to go on leave, or worst case scenario, they're going to leave the business. And then what you're left with, well, quite simply, you have no process, you have no system, and you have no hero. And when those fires start up and when the chaos ensues, it's then a mad scramble to try and figure out, oh, what did John always do? Or what did Jane always do? How did they fix this problem? And then what either happens is complete chaos ensues, or the next hero steps up. But it tends to take a bit of time. So if you're scientific, how do you work? What is the approach that you follow? Well, if you're in a scientific environment, what you tend to do is you build a reliable process that protects you. You build the system process that insulates you from that chaos that happens around. And the way this tends to happen is, in an organization, you find that there's multiple people that are skilled. The company's taken the time, made the investment, said, we need to upskill our team. We can't be reliant on one person, because John went on leave last year and man, it was chaos. So what does the company do? They upskill the rest of the team. They select a formal methodology, is what they tend to do, and then train people in that methodology. So once they've done that, where do they focus and what do they emphasize on? They realize that data drives everything. You can't be reliant on that person just knowing the numbers. You have to have good data that's standardized, that everyone can see and is then displayed to them in some sort of formal system. The biggest thing here is they tend to keep it very simple. There's a very simple, repeatable, standardized process that follows formal reviews, where you have weekly action plans that get put into place, and you review how are those plans delivering against the KPIs and the business targets and the business measures that you've put in place. And they have essentially this bubble that works or sits around the different components in the supply chain that protects them from that variability that you just know is coming. And the biggest thing here is that they realize that a supply chain isn't linear. It's this complex adaptive system that you need to manage, and they adopt that continuous improvement mindset that says, how did we perform? How did those KPIs measures? And those KPIs and measures, how did they read last month compared to the month before? Are we heading in the right direction? How can we do better? Making small adjustments continuously just to get better and better and better as time goes on. Now, if you haven't gathered yet, we tend to feel that the formal approach or the scientific approach is the more robust, more, let's call it, stronger process, the stronger approach to follow in the world in which we operate, because we know there's variability. We know there's complexity that exists in the world. And by having this process in place, you're not as reliant on those individual planners. And you can imagine, if you are that individual person in an organization, yes, it must be great at certain times when you solve those problems, but to have the stress and pressure of working in that environment and having a manager say, oh, you can't really take leave next week. We're going into our peak season. We need you here to help us plan. It's not a great position to be in. And you'll tend to find supply chain people work in very stressful environments because there's a lot of pressure and a lot of business emphasis on getting this right. So we're a big fan of helping companies move from an informal approach to a slightly more formal, structured way of thinking. And how do we do this? Well, again, like I said, we've gone through this a few times. There's a fairly standard way you can go about doing this. And it all starts with step number one, defining your methodology. So how do you want to go about planning in your organization? And there's loads of options out there. You must have learned about it in university, whether it's Lean, Six Sigma, MRP, forecast-driven distribution planning, theory of constraints. There's a wide range of methods out there that companies use for supply chain planning. And in a lot of environments, they tend to use multiple, depending on where you are in the supply chain. They may use Lean in their manufacturing planning and traditional distribution requirements planning when they get into their logistics networks. But step number one is defining your methodology. What methodology are you going to follow? Because at that point, you can take step number two and train your people. And it's amazing when we walk into an environment, we ask the question, have your people been formally trained in the processes that are in place in the organization and in the methodology that you're following? And what tends to happen in a lot of informal environments is you talk to the planners and they say, well, there was a lot of on-the-job training. I sat down with the person that was doing the job. They explained to me what they were doing. They explained to me how they did it. They more or less explained to me how they get the numbers that they get. And from there, it was, okay, learn as you do. But very few companies have actually formally invested in training people in the methodology that they follow. Once you've done that, the next step, like we said, is data drives everything. Information drives decision-making in an organization. So what you want to do is try and automate that data flow as far as possible. And you'll find there's a lot of papers and studies that have been written. Never has the business world been as data rich as it is today. There are so many data points that you have in an organization. And as far as possible, you want to try and automate that data flow into some sort of formal planning system. Once you've done that, and once you've started dealing with this sea of data that you have, what you'll tend to find is that there's always data challenges. There's always master data that is incorrect in a business, whether it is an item lead time that isn't captured, whether it's a minimum order quantity of an item that is incorrect. There are always challenges with data in a business. It could be that sort of master data. It could be transactional data, old supplier purchase orders that haven't been closed, or an old customer order that had a delivery date of 2018 that's still in the system. The customer's never going to accept it, but it's sitting there essentially collecting dust. Now, this is one of the biggest challenges that business have. And what you tend to find is organizations will launch campaigns to say, for the next 2 months, we're going to clean up our master data. And they throw everything at it. And it's exceptionally time consuming. But the sort of thing that data is it's constantly building, constantly developing. So you've got to fix the data, but then you've got to keep fixing it. So you've got to have some sort of mechanism that shows you where's my data incorrect and where's it hurting my process. And you've got to keep working on that as you go. That master data correction never goes away. It's an ongoing activity. Once you've done that, the next thing is to document your process. So the biggest benefit of documenting your process isn't to have it down looking pretty in a file, in an ISO 9001 document that says we've got processes in the business. It's not even to give to the next person to be able to train them. Documenting your process forces you in the organization to sit down and say, what are we currently doing? and to question, why are we doing it? If it's not adding value, why are we doing it? And the only way you can really unpack that is by sitting down and writing out, this is what we do. This is what we do on a daily basis. This is what we do on a weekly basis. This is what we do on a monthly basis. And once you've done that, once you've sat down and actually documented it, it's amazing how often you pick up, well, why are we doing this? Well, we've always done it. For the last 10, 20 years, this is what we've done. But if it's not adding value, why do it? And what you tend to find is a lot of simplification that actually comes out and sitting down and documenting your day-to-day activities. Once you've done that and you decided this is the process we're going to follow, well, this is where those weekly continuous improvement meetings come in. How do we sit down and say, what was the plan last week? Did we deliver against that plan? What's the plan next week? So we know what needs to be done. The big thing with these plans is when you sit down and you see, well, this was the plan last week. This is what happened. Fix the issue then and there. What tends to happen is companies sit down at the end of the year and they look at their financial numbers and they say, oh, we didn't hit our budget. Why? No one remembers because it happened 6 months ago. And there's been a lot of chaos between 6 months ago and today. Whereas if you're sitting down and you're running these continuous improvement meetings, you're saying, okay, there was a slight issue last week. What do we need to do next week to try and course correct? We make a change and we review at the end of the next week. Did it fix the problem? It may very well not have. So then you tweak something again. And you just have this continuous improvement mindset as you work through the business. Final step then is run those formal monthly process reviews and KPI reviews. And here's the important part with these is with the involvement of senior management. And when we say senior management, we're talking about the C-suite level, senior leaders in the business. We're talking about Exco. They see the results of this planning process, but they need to be involved in this process, that they understand the implications of their decisions on day-to-day planning. And the only way to do that is to involve them in these monthly meetings to say, this is our process, here's how it performed, this is our plan for next month. Does it tie in with the strategy of the business? Because if it doesn't tie in with the senior management strategy, operationally, we're pulling in different directions, and there's constantly going to be struggles and difficulty between those different levels in the organization. Now, very conscious of time, would love to take everyone through this in more detail, but what I'm going to focus on is step number 1 and step number 2, because those are really the quickest and easiest to do. Also, they add the most value in the process. Okay. So step number 1 is define your methodology. Now the question becomes, which methodology do you follow? I said there's loads out there. Well, I completely acknowledge at this stage that I am very biased. I always own and acknowledge my bias, but I like to base it on fact and base it on my own personal experience. Who's heard of Gartner? If you haven't heard of Gartner, this is a website and an organization you should be following as young professionals. Gartner are supply chain analysts. They essentially spend every day analyzing what's happening in the supply chain world. What are the new trends? What are the new technologies? What are the new challenges? What are companies doing to fix them? And they publish a lot of papers that says this is the latest thinking. This is where the market's going. This is what's happening in supply chain. And this was a study that was done recently in 2020. Interesting timing. This one was at the end of 2020. So you can think what the world looked like back then. And they went out and did a survey to say, how are companies responding to this disrupted world in which we find ourselves now? You know, pandemics, war in Ukraine, vessels getting stuck in the Suez Canal, potential recession in the US. These are disruptive factors in the world that are not going away. This disruption is just becoming more frequent and more impactful in our world. Excellent book written by Sean Cully on that, by the way. Tanya should be able to give you that book. Great read, worth reading that, unpacks that concept very well. But Gartner went out and they did these surveys with different companies. And what's interesting is if you have a look at those top 2 points, is within the next 2 years, where are companies investing in their supply chains? And where are we going to go and spend the money that we have? And you'll see they're investing in making their supply chains more agile and more resilient. Why? Because they've now learned the lesson. Companies have gotten the smack on the wrist that the sort of disruption that the last few years has introduced, where before they were trying to run very lean, very optimized, they're now realizing they need to build resilience in their supply chain. And the concept of a resilient supply chain has been written about, I don't know how many Google search pages. You can go and Google resilient supply chain. There's loads of articles. But the last few years has really highlighted it. And this is backed up article that was written by The Economist, where they said a focus on maximum efficiency actually harms resilience. And companies found this a few years ago, where there's a disruption. If they're running exceptionally lean and they don't have those bubbles built around them to protect them against that variability, what ends up happening is they actually really get hurt when something goes wrong. So taking this in mind, let's have a look at the methodology. Let's look about what methods there are. So what methods are available and what's the latest thinking in this VUCA world, this volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous environment where we're working? Well, these are a few really cool new technologies that everyone's talking about. Artificial intelligence, machine learning, MERO, so multi-echelon inventory optimization. Great acronym, that one. Supply chain's full of acronyms. I don't even have demand sensing on here, but there are all these new technologies. I always like to refer to them as the sexy technologies that have come out that, make no mistake, are excellent. But the issue with these technologies is that they're not necessarily a new methodology. They're not a new theory of constraints, a new Six Sigma, a new MRP. What they are is a way to get a more accurate forecast. And they absolutely do. Using this technology will definitely get you a more accurate forecast. But here's the issue. What most companies are doing is they're investing millions of dollars in getting this right. And what do? They take that information and they feed it into their traditional planning process, their MPS, their master production schedule, and their MRP, their material requirements plan. Now, what are you doing? You're taking 21st century information and feeding it into a planning method that was really invented in the 1960s. Well, technically the 1950s, but became commercialized in the 1960s and 1970s. And the truth is that most people don't realize is it hasn't changed. It's fundamentally still the same logic, the same calculations that were used back then. Question becomes, how's the world changed? And planners know this. Planners instinctively feel this. So what do? They take this advanced information and they feed it into Excel and they try and make sense of it. And those artistic planners, those firefighters, those problem solvers, the people that care, they're trying to make sense of this information in Excel because that's where they can manipulate it to try and get to that replenishment process decision. How much do I need to buy? When and where? And it's all being driven out of Excel. Now, this is where my bias comes in. Now, what's changed and what's new and what's the latest development that we're seeing internationally, a new methodology that's been developed? And this is where I'm going to introduce you to a concept, if you haven't heard of it before, called demand-driven, or people often refer to it as DDMRP. Now, DDMRP is really a method to model, plan, and manage your supply chain to give you a supply order generation indication. Basically telling you supply orders, what do I need to buy from suppliers, what do I need to manufacture, and how do I distribute it in my network. The great thing about this is it doesn't take traditional planning and throw the baby out with the bathwater. It still uses traditional MRP, DRP, Lean, Theory of Constraints, and Six Sigma. The thing is, It takes out of those methods what works well and ties it together with a few key pieces of innovation. And this is something that's really been developed over the last 10 to 15 years. DDMRP itself, even recently, there's books being published by an organization called the Demand-Driven Institute, who owns the methodology, and it's constantly being worked on. And this methodology has been built specifically for the VUCA world. So how well does it work? What are some of the results achieved by clients? And there's now hundreds of implementations of this around the world. Well, number one, and what's great about the methodology is it does start with training. Now, there's been about 9,000 planners formally trained around the world and multiple companies in all sorts of industries that have implemented this logic. And that, again, is a great thing. You don't have this concept of lean being used in the production environment and distribution planning or TOC or Six Sigma used in a different part of the organization. It's a common methodology across the organization in multiple industries. Anywhere where you have this replenishment decision that needs to be made and complexity in the environment works very well. Now, these are some of the results that have been achieved by companies that have implemented, and you can go to the Demand-Driven Institute's website. They love publishing the case studies, and companies tell their stories, and these are the results that they're publishing. By far, my favorite, and the only one I ever talk about, is the last one. Easy and intuitive. This planning method is nothing complicated. There's no big maths. There's nothing to the power of anything. There's no square root of this. There's no multi-echelon inventory optimization. It is really basic, really simple, very visual. And planners love that because they understand it. And as soon as they understand it, they follow it. And as soon as they follow it, your managers and the companies now all of a sudden in control of that replenishment decision, and they can tie strategy to it. So by far for me, that is the biggest benefit of DDMRP. Now, we mentioned training here. Let's talk about the training. And sorry, the one benefit I forgot about is what we find in implementations. Excel largely goes away because people work in the system now that they follow it and understand it. Now, on to training. Quickly before I wrap up. This training, like I said, is owned and governed by the Demand-Driven Institute. It's also certified by an organization called ASCM, Association for Supply Chain Management. And there are a number of training courses you can do. Now, these aren't 6-month university courses. Each of these is a 2-day training course going through a set of slides where it teaches you how do you work as a demand-driven planner in the operational planning process, that replenishment process. Then from a demand-driven leader perspective, how do you analyze the model? How do you drive your S&OP process? And adaptive S&OP, how does that tactical plan tie into your strategic plan? And we see a lot of companies now actually adopting and investing in this training. Number one, their people aren't out of the office for an extended period. Number two, there's a lot of value when they come back. And if anyone says to me, I'm thinking about studying something in planning, and again, I acknowledge my bias, I always recommend this Demand-Driven Planner course as a first step in understanding the methodology. Okay. So now, to wrap up, what's going to happen? You've attended the SAPEX Young Professional Conference. You may be already working in industry or getting into it, finishing your studies and going into work. What's going to happen? You're going to sit down at your desk and your manager's going to say, all right, let's get going. And it's overwhelming. There's a lot. There's this complex thing that you need to manage. So what we like to do and provide people with in organization to try and define their planning process is a simple set of questions. Try and say, is your organization artistic or is it scientific? And what I've got here is a list of 7 questions. If you scan the QR code, it'll take you to a page where you'll see the questions. So you can go back and keep it, save it, answer it later. What you've got on the right-hand side is the answer we tend to get from most organizations. Have you defined your methodology? No. Have you formally trained your people? No, not really. Are you using Excel spreadsheets a lot? Absolutely. And to today, I'm still waiting for someone to disagree with me. The most used planning tool in the world is Excel. Is your master data up to date? Tends not to be. And when last have you calculated your actual target inventory levels and availability? Well, most companies don't do it frequently. Why? It tends to be quite difficult and quite time consuming. Do you know your daily priorities against the open orders that you have? Most companies say no. And does senior management attend monthly planning meetings? Well, we tend to get a chuckle out of that one. So here's a set of questions you can take away and use, walk into your environment and ask these questions. And it's going to tell you a lot about which side of the coin are you actually being driven onto. Okay. Now, I'm going to wrap up there. I'm very, very particular about time. I tried my best to save a bit of time for questions. I'm going to leave you with a quote: the future is flow. And we really follow flow-based planning. It's a concept that you can Google, you can follow. Demand-driven's fundamental principle is driving flow through the organization. This QR code is going to take you to my LinkedIn page. Feel free to follow me. Feel free to go and follow B2Ys. We publish a lot of content. You can follow Demand-Driven Institute. They also publish a lot of content on demand-driven topics and the latest thinking. If you don't have a LinkedIn profile as a young professional, I'd highly suggest you get one. That's how you market your personal brand. But I hope you got value out of it, and I'm going to pause here for questions. Any questions?
Some questions here. What are some of the solutions or challenges experienced by B2Ys as orders move from downstream to upstream that can make or break your supply chain?
Okay, interesting. So what tends to happen in traditional planning, and I think where the question's coming from, is let's call it downstream. So a customer places a massive order. Normally they order 100 units per week. Now all of a sudden they've won a big tender. Congratulations, well done, very good. 100 becomes 10,000. Now what tends to happen is that 10,000 just blows all the way through the supply chain, through the distribution network, through your manufacturing facility, through your raw materials, and all of a sudden you're stocked out. And where you'd normally deliver to a customer in a week, now you have to take into account your purchasing lead times, and your customer's upset because you're saying to them you're going to deliver in 3 months' time because there's a raw material component that you need to order from China. Now, this is where companies found themselves, like I mentioned earlier, where they were running very lean. Now, what demand-driven does, and something you'll find if you go through the training, is we position strategically placed inventory buffers all the way through the process, not only at finished goods and raw materials, but potentially also at the intermediate level. So what's traditionally seen as bad inventory or work in process can actually be a really strong leverage point. And by having these buffers in your process, they handle that sort of variability that much better. And not only are they built to handle that variability very well, the second that big order gets placed by the customer, your priority all shifts to that, because demand-driven is also an execution management tool. So it's going to see that big order and immediately prioritize to say, you need to focus on that or you're going to be in trouble. So again, everything in the methodology is driven around that volatile VUCA world to try and make sure that you've got availability to a customer if you've said you want to have that availability. Hope that answers your question.
Okay, we're going to do one more question and then we're out of time. So,
cool. I'll try to answer it quickly.
Big data at the granular level is probably one of the sources of sense making and insights generator to your planning and optimization management. What are some of the tools and methodologies you use to qualify data integrity before generating these insights to planning optimally?
Okay, so I'm going to touch very quickly on two of them. And when you talk about big data, where big data is exceptionally valuable is in that forecast generation. So there are very advanced forecasting algorithms nowadays where you can run machine learning forecasts where you load not only your time series, so how's the item historically sold, but you add in all the features of the item. You say, is it ice cream? Is it an item that was sold on promotion? What was the weather like over that period? What does the weather look like going forward? There's a lot of relational data that you can feed in. And these forecasting algorithms are built to say, is this an item that's affected by the weather? Is it highly price sensitive? As granular data as you can give that machine learning algorithm, it'll give you a better forecast. Now they're exceptionally valuable, and we have that ability where we generate machine learning forecasts for clients and work with them to get that right. But the biggest place where data hurts businesses is their traditional ERP data. It's their planning master data, it's their transactional data. And there again, we work very closely with clients to say, well, you've got 1,000 products that you're planning for, you're missing lead times for 150 of them. If you don't have lead times, you can't plan. Your oldest supply order is due to be delivered in 2019, but it's now 2022. We need to go and close that order because it's impacting you. So we spend a lot of time highlighting that to businesses. But like I said, it's an ongoing challenge. And the more data you have, the more products you have, the more disciplined businesses need to be to manage that. And that's why in big organizations, you tend to get people that are, they even call them master data custodians. It's the people that actually focus on that to make sure they get it right. Because as soon as you take that and put it into any formal system or formal process, that's where you spend your effort.
Okay, so I hope that answers the question. We need to wrap up now, otherwise we're going to be late. Alan, you are on time. We just ran over with a bit of the questions.
All good.
So thank you so much for your insights. I see a big round of applause here. Yes, lots of clapping. There you go.
Great. Thank you. What I will do, Tanya, is I've got a bit of time. I'll hang around in one of the tables. If anyone wants to come find me and chat and have a few questions, more than happy. Got a bit of time before my flight a little bit later, so all good.
Thank you so much, Alan. We really appreciate your time. And as always, your support of SAPEX. Safe flight.
Thank you. Thanks. And enjoy the rest of the conference. I know it's been good so far. Great speakers coming.
Yes.
Yeah. Cheers, everyone.
Bye.